The moment the flight attendant's hand wrapped around Langston Miles's throat, the entire cabin fell into stunned silence. A black man in a tailored suit, seated calmly in first class, had asked for a meal. In return, he was choked. No warning, no provocation, just the raw expression of unchecked power. Passengers gasped. A camera phone rose. Somewhere in the back, someone whispered, "Did he just?" But it was already too late. Langston's calm demeanor didn't crack. Even as the fingers dug into his skin, even as the man hissed venom into his ear, he didn't resist. He didn't shout. He didn't fight. Because he didn't need to. 10 minutes later, the plane made an unscheduled emergency landing. Police were waiting on the tarmac. But what no one aboard that flight realized was this wasn't just about one man. It was about a system. A reckoning had just taken flight, and this time it wouldn't end when the plane touched down. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The early morning energy at Ellsworth International buzzed with familiar rhythms. Rollers clacked across tiles. Gate agents repeated boarding calls with mechanical cheer, and the scent of roasted coffee drifted faintly from the lounges. Among the crowd, Langston Miles moved with quiet precision. Dressed in a sharply tailored dark suit, his presence was magnetic but unassuming. He had long since learned the power of quiet excellence in loud rooms. To the casual observer, Langston might have appeared to be just another executive in transit. But to those who looked closer, the details spoke volumes: the subtle gold lapel pin representing his firm, the custom leather briefcase embossed with his initials, and the way gate attendants straightened as he approached, sensing a gravity they couldn't name. Still, even in his success, Langston had come to expect a particular flavor of treatment, overly polite and nervingly calculated. The gate agents today were no different. Smiles, two rehearsed eyes that flicked up and down with unconscious evaluation. He nodded in return, offering thanks with the same controlled grace he brought into every boardroom. But the moment Langston stepped onto Flight 762, everything changed. The air was different, thicker, colder. Carter Vance, the lead flight attendant, stood rigid near the aircraft entrance, arms crossed and face carved in contempt. His eyes locked on Langston the way a border guard might assess an intruder. No greeting, no smile, just a hard stare that said, "You don't belong here." Langston held the gaze with unflinching calm and offered a brief nod before walking past. His seat 2A was nestled against the window, plush, spacious, reserved long ago by his executive assistant. As he stowed his briefcase, Vance didn't offer help, just watched silently. Langston didn't need assistance, but the absence of courtesy was noted. He sat, adjusted his cufflinks, and opened a contract draft from Zurich. Diving into work, around him, the cabin hummed, passengers chatting quietly, crew preparing for takeoff. But from his periphery, Langston could feel Vance's gaze lingering. A quiet hostility clung to the air like static. Moments later, Vance approached with the menu. Rather than handing it over respectfully, he tossed it onto Langston's tray like a fast food receipt. "Pick fast, don't hold up service," he muttered, eyes avoiding contact. His voice was clipped, almost daring Langston to react. Langston looked at the crumpled menu. He didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly circled his usual grilled chicken and slid it back. There was no need for escalation, not yet. Years in hostile negotiations had taught him the first to raise their voice loses. But the humiliation continued, subtle and surgical. Others in first class received champagne flutes with polished service. Langston was handed a bottle of water without a word. When others were offered warm towels, Langston's seat was skipped. Even his request for an extra napkin was met with a snide, "We're out." From seat 3B, a man with salt and pepper hair leaned forward. "He's got an attitude," he whispered, nodding discreetly toward Vance. Langston gave a faint smile. He'd heard it before, different city, different uniform, same story. An hour in turbulence hit. Langston reached for the call button. His water was gone, his throat dry. Vance arrived slowly, bottle in hand, but held it just out of reach. Thirsty, he said, mockery laced in his tone. Langston took it eyes steady, but the moment felt charged. The air between them crackled not with lightning, but with something heavier disdain masquerading as service. It wasn't just personal, it was institutional, embedded in every cold gesture. When dinner arrived, Langston didn't get his grilled chicken. Instead, a foil-wrapped sandwich was slammed onto his tray, greasy, lukewarm, mismatched. Kitchen's backed up, Vance snapped. Take it or leave it. No utensils, no napkin, just humiliation on a tray. The cabin felt it. Heads turned subtly. Some looked away. One woman whispered, "Is this happening?" But no one intervened. That was the unwritten rule of first-class eyes, forward lips, sealed. Langston unwrapped the sandwich. It wasn't about hunger. It was about what it symbolized. He wasn't being served. He was being told. "You're being targeted," whispered the man from 3B again. "You should talk to the captain." Langston didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because beneath his silence, something had begun to shift. Not in anger, but in preparation. He pressed the call button again. Deliberate. Calm. This wasn't over. Langston Miles had built his empire the same way he handled disrespect, quietly, relentlessly, and without ever raising his voice. He wasn't just a CEO, he was the CEO. Founder of Miles Tech, a multi-billion-dollar technology infrastructure firm, powering some of the most secure banking networks in the world. A man whose boardroom decisions had reshaped entire sectors. And yet here he sat in 2A, dismissed and disrespected, as if none of that mattered. Because to Carter, Vance Langston was just a passenger, a black man in a first-class seat, a challenge to his fragile control. As the tension simmered beneath a thin veneer of civility, Langston remained calm, but the wheels were already turning. He wasn't just enduring the humiliation, he was observing it, measuring the system, watching how silence enabled rot. When Vance had mocked him earlier, Langston hadn't responded out of weakness. He had held back because he knew how this game was played. Let the guilty speak freely. Let the system reveal itself. Back home, Langston's executive suite awaited him with wall-to-wall screens, analysts tracking stocks and sentiment in real time. His legal department could file an injunction within hours. His media consultants had direct pipelines to every major outlet. And perhaps most significantly, his equity stake in several Falcon Air competitors meant he had financial leverage that could shift entire market conversations. He had power, but he used it precisely like a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. The second call button, press, was not an act of desperation. It was documentation, procedure, a timestamp for the log. And when Vance returned this time with visible irritation in his step, Langston knew the situation had entered its next phase. "You got a problem." Or Fancy Vance sneered, stepping into Langston's personal space. Langston stood not quickly, but deliberately. "I'll speak to the captain now," he said with the calm authority of a man used to having access to presidents, not just pilots. Vance's face twisted. "Sit down," he barked, voice rising in a flash of desperation. And then violence. The grip, the shove, the choking. For Langston, the physical act wasn't the shock. It was the choice Vance made. In that moment, Carter Vance revealed himself fully, not just a petty man with a uniform, but a system-given skin. Arrogance with epaulets. And that system had just self-incriminated publicly. Langston's control never wavered. Even as Vance's hand tightened, Langston met his eyes not with fear, but with memory. He remembered the banker who once told him he didn't look like a CEO, the investor who asked if he was with security, the board member who thought Langston must be in the wrong meeting. He remembered every insult he turned into a shareholder deal. From the rear of the plane, passengers stood. A man shouted. A phone camera rolled. But Langston didn't move until Vance let go, until the system on its own fractured. And then Langston straightened his collar, adjusted his tie, and sat down. Composed. Control reasserted. A young flight attendant, newer, quieter, rushed forward. "What's going on?" he asked, eyes wide. "He threatened me," Vance roared, pointing at Langston, but no one believed him. "I saw everything," a man near the aisle called out. "He did nothing wrong. You assaulted him." Langston said nothing, didn't need to. His restraint was louder than any accusation. The next move wasn't rage. It was escalation by design. He stood, walked to the cockpit, and requested a conversation. His voice was measured, his recounting clinical. No embellishments, only facts sharp and undeniable. And when the captain saw the forming bruise on Langston's neck, his eyes changed. The moment became real. The call to air traffic control came swiftly. Emergency landing, not for weather, not for mechanical issues, but for justice. Inside the cockpit, the captain made the call with trembling fingers. Outside the cabin, the sky stretched endless. But inside, the balance of power had already shifted. Langston returned to his seat. Vance paced. "Everyone sides with him," he muttered under his breath, sweat now visible on his brow. "Because he's rich, that's all." But that wasn't it. It wasn't the money. It was the way Langston had carried the weight of every injustice with grace. The way he'd refused to let rage steal his clarity. The way he'd chosen control over chaos every time. That's what made him dangerous. As the plane descended, whispers rippled through the cabin. Some pulled out phones, others sat still watching history unfold at 35,000 feet. Langston gazed through the window, watching the clouds peel away. Not with vengeance, but with vision. Because he wasn't about to file a complaint. He was about to change everything. The landing was rough, intentional, almost symbolic. As the plane's wheels slammed onto the runway at Roarfield Airport, a screech echoed through the cabin, cutting across the silence like a verdict. They weren't at their intended destination, but something far more significant had just been reached, a breaking point. Inside, the aircraft tension lingered like fog. No announcement had been made beyond the vague security concern, but everyone knew. Eyes shifted toward Langston Miles. He remained still in seat 2A, calm, composed, a quiet epicenter in a swirling storm. Meanwhile, Carter Vance stood near the rear galley, arms crossed tightly, breathing sharp and shallow. His confidence, once venomous, had cracked, replaced by something hollow and brittle. As the jet bridge approached and officers boarded, the systemic rot began to surface. The arrest of Vance was swift and firm. He didn't go quietly. He barked denials, threw out half-formed accusations, and pointed back toward Langston as if that could absolve him. But the officers didn't flinch. They didn't need to. Multiple passengers had already spoken up. Footage was captured. Witnesses were aligned. And most damningly, Vance himself had confirmed the culture. In one breath, everyone sides with him because he's rich. But the truth was, this wasn't about wealth. It was about visibility, about a system that had for far too long operated in the dark, unchecked, unchallenged, unaccountable. Back in Falcon Air's New York headquarters, the situation reached the executive floor within minutes. A group of PR executives huddled inside a sterile boardroom, eyes wide as they watched the first viral clip of Vance's assault spread across social media like wildfire. "This can't be real," one of them whispered. But it was, and it was only the beginning. Because Langston's team had already begun compiling a dossier quietly, efficiently, and ruthlessly. Emails from previous flight attendants. Complaints from passengers buried under inconclusive labels. Internal reports that mysteriously disappeared after being handled internally. It was a pattern, a culture of silence wrapped in polished uniforms, and we apologize for the inconvenient scripts. Langston didn't need to fabricate a case. The case was already built by Falcon Air themselves. All he had to do was expose it. Back on the ground inside a secure conference room at the airport, Langston sat with two officers. His tone was deliberate as he spoke, eyes unwavering. He didn't ask for an apology. He demanded accountability. "I want Falcon investigated," he said. "Not just the man, the machine." One of the officers, Sergeant Blaine, met his gaze. "You think this goes higher?" Langston's answer was cold and surgical. I know it does. Upstairs, Carter Vance sat in a holding cell, his mind racing. His phone calls to the union went unanswered. His once impenetrable armor tenure connections, a history of explaining things away, now failed him. He could almost hear the whispers from management. Let's just ride this out. He's difficult, but he's ours. That's how the system worked. Until now. Until someone like Langston refused to be silent. And as the hours passed, more voices emerged. A former Falcon flight attendant messaged Langston's media team offering her testimony. He once screamed at a single mother for asking for formula water, she wrote. HR told me not to escalate. Another, we complained about Vance 3 times. Each time they said he was valued for leadership. We stopped trying. A third, he wasn't the only one, just the boldest. Langston's media advisor leaned over his phone and whispered, "It's starting. We just got our first internal source." Langston nodded. Good. Let the rot show itself. At the same moment inside Falcon Air HQ, senior leadership began drafting an internal memo. It used familiar words, regret review investigation. But the tone was defensive, not contrite. Their goal wasn't reform, it was containment. They still thought they could manage this. They didn't realize they were no longer in control. Langston wasn't looking for a payout or press sound bites. He was looking for a reckoning. Not just for what had been done to him, but for the hundreds, maybe thousands, who had experienced smaller, quieter humiliations and were told, that's just how it is. The same rot that had allowed Vance to rise through the ranks despite complaints was now eating Falcon Air from the inside out. Executives began deleting emails. Mid-level managers frantically contacted HR asking if any of their own names had come up in reports. And Vance, sweaty, frantic, cornered, kept repeating the same words. They let me do it. They knew. In a luxury hotel room just blocks from the airport, Langston sat across from his COO, sipping tea. The executive's laptop glowed softly, displaying an open browser page. Stock alerts, public sentiment dashboards, legal analysis. We've identified 12 separate employee reports tied to Vance's department, his COO said. 9 were dismissed, 3 were internally settled. Quietly, Langston stared out the window. You think this is about a chokehold, he murmured. But the real violence was the silence. That's when his phone buzzed. An anonymous email attached a whistleblower affidavit. Subject, the culture you're about to break open. Langston's hands stilled above the table. He didn't need more proof. But now he had it. And Falcon Air had no idea what was coming next. The cabin was still grounded, but the storm had already taken off. Inside the terminal at Roarfield Airport, passengers disembarked slowly, heads swiveling, phones in hand, whispers bouncing off the sterile walls. No one said it aloud, but all of them knew they had witnessed something historic, not just a confrontation, but a fracture. The kind that exposed what people preferred to pretend didn't exist. Among them was Aaron Hill's seat 3B, middle-aged father of 2 supply chain consultant. He'd spent the flight reviewing spreadsheets on his tablet, sipping bourbon. But now he couldn't focus on anything but the image burned into his memory, a man in a suit being choked like a threat for simply asking to speak to the captain. And the way Langston Miles had handled it with dignity, sharper than any outburst, haunted him. Aaron hadn't spoken up then, not loudly, just a whisper. You're being targeted. A coward's gesture, he now realized. But something inside him had shifted. That night at his hotel, he composed an email. Not to Falcon Air, to the media. I was on flight 762. I saw everything. And I want to testify on behalf of Mr. Miles. He hit send before fear could talk him out of it. And he wasn't the only one. A woman from Economy Row 22C posted a TikTok. In it, she recounted the moment Vance was escorted off. They walked him out in cuffs. And that black man, the one in the suit, he just sat there, calm, like he already knew this would happen. Within hours, the video gained traction. Then it exploded. The algorithm knew a story when it saw one dignity versus hate. restraint versus abuse, a silent witness against a system in collapse. Hashtags began a trend. Flight 762 is stand with Langston respect. 1,000 feet Falcon Air's social team scrambled. Comments flooded every recent post. Their customer service DMs became war zones of demands, outrage, and screenshots. Meanwhile, Langston Miles was 3 steps ahead. His team had already created a secure portal where witnesses could submit statements anonymously. By sunrise, over 300 messages had arrived not just from passengers but former Falcon employees, and even some from rival airlines. One unsigned read, "We were trained to de-escalate, but some supervisors taught us something else. Ignore the ones who don't fit the profile." We knew what that meant. We just didn't say it out loud. Another Vance made a woman cry once because she asked if the wine was complimentary. I tried to report it. HR told me, "That's just Carter. Strong personality." And then there was the call. It came to Langston's assistant from a restricted number. A woman's voice steady but hushed. "My name is Dana Patel. I'm a crew lead at Falcon. I've seen this for years. What happened to Mr. Miles? That wasn't the first time. I've got records, logs they lost. I want to help." Langston listened silently as the assistant relayed the message. Then he gave a single nod. "Flyer in, first class." He didn't just want public sympathy, he wanted irrefutable truth. Back at Falcon Air HQ, the internal panic was building. The VP of Human Resources was summoned into a closed-door meeting. He arrived, pale sweat beading under his collar. "Why are there this many complaints suddenly surfacing?" the COO snapped. "They were always there," the HR VP admitted. "We just filed them differently. Buried them, you mean?" The room fell silent. The rot had always been there. It had simply taken someone powerful, principled, and publicly humiliated to bring light into the shadows. And the light was spreading. On national morning television, a former Falcon executive appeared as a guest commentator. She hadn't worked there in 6 years, but her voice carried weight. This didn't start with Flight 762. This started with a culture that punishes truth-telling and rewards silence. The host blinked. "You're saying this goes beyond Carter Vance?" The woman nodded. "Falcon Air's culture doesn't need a cover-up. The cover-up is the culture." The statement went viral before the segment ended. And back in Langston's suite, he watched it all unfold with a stillness that unnerved even his inner circle. He didn't smile. He didn't sigh in relief. He just said, "They're waking up." Witnesses, workers, strangers. The ripple had become a wave. What started as a chokehold was now a movement. The war wouldn't be fought on emotion. Langston Miles knew that instinctively. Outrage faded. Sympathy shifted. But facts documentation. That was unshakable. That was permanent. He wasn't just preparing for a lawsuit. He was preparing for a dismantling. Back in the downtown suite that served as his war room, Langston stood before a sprawling digital wall of monitors, each screen alive with flickering data, news reports, social media sentiment, internal whistleblower submissions, stock price trackers. His assistant Maya approached with a secure tablet. "We verified 23 passenger accounts. 13 gave permission to go public. 4 recorded videos. 3 were corporate attorneys. They're all standing by to testify." Langston nodded without turning. "And Falcon Air's internal structure?" "Pulling it now," Maya replied, swiping through documents. "Leaked org charts." Vance reported to Regional Supervisor Elaine Moorcroft. "She has 2 prior misconduct suppressions on records sealed under HR discretion." Langston's eyes narrowed. "Get me everything on her, and cross-reference her connections with board members." He wasn't looking for one villain. He was mapping the system. Every policy, every enabler, every silence. By mid-morning, a private investigator from Langston's retained firm arrived, a former FBI cybercrime specialist named Armand Delgado. Quiet, gray-bearded, with the composure of a man used to high-stakes intelligence work. Delgado placed a USB stick on the glass table. "What you're about to see," he said, "is from Falcon's internal complaint resolution database, shadow access logs. These files weren't meant to be public or even permanent." Langston opened the first file. His lips tightened as he read Employee T. Nguyen Dade, August 14, 2021. Report passenger in 1A, elderly black man, was ignored for 40 minutes while others received full service. Supervisor Vance responded, "Tell him we're out of coffee. Resolution non-actionable. Logged under interpretation discrepancy." Langston clicked through more, each one a testimony, each one an echo of a pattern. He didn't flinch. He absorbed them layer by layer. Systematic disregard disguised as policy. Dismissive behavior coded as service discretion. Microaggressions turned into paperless dust. "This is the architecture," he murmured. "It's not one man, it's scaffolding." Delgado nodded grimly. "Vance was the symptom. This is your pathology." Later that afternoon, Langston met privately with Dana Patel, the flight lead who had risked everything to come forward. She looked younger than expected, maybe late 20s, with tired eyes that had seen too much for too long. They met in a secure corporate suite, Maya sitting nearby, recorder rolling. "I joined Falcon at 22. Dana began, voice steady. "I believed in their people-first mission. I was wrong." She detailed patterns of misconduct promotions awarded not for performance but for loyalty to silence. Crew leads who bullied younger attendants. Passengers profiled by appearance. Reports that vanished between submission and action. "Carter wasn't the worst," she added flatly. "He was just the boldest. He knew no one would stop him." She slid a manila folder across the table. Inside shift rosters, personnel complaints, internal memos, names highlighted in red. Langston didn't blink. "Are you prepared to testify under oath?" Dana nodded. "They tried to bury us. I'm done hiding." As the hours stretched into night, the dossier grew. Langston's legal team worked in shifts, cataloging, notarizing, organizing. Every account was backed by timestamped data. Every video was verified for authenticity. Every testimony was double-checked. It was no longer just evidence. It was an indictment. Meanwhile, public pressure surged. More employees came forward, 2 former pilots, 1 gate manager, even an HR intern who had been tasked with sanitizing complaint logs. At the center of it all was Langston, calm, relentless. He wasn't shouting into cameras. He wasn't tweeting threads of anger. He was moving methodically with surgical precision. "Are you planning to file criminal charges?" Maya asked late that night, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Langston looked up from a table littered with documents. "Eventually." She raised an eyebrow. "Then what's the plan now?" He leaned back in his chair, eyes cold and focused. "Right now, I build the case that makes the CEO resign before the first subpoena is served." Silence. Then Maya whispered, "That's not retaliation." "No," Langston said. "It's restoration." He looked at the wall of faces, witnesses, employees, passengers. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who was told their pain wasn't protocol." He stood slowly, walking to the edge of the panoramic window that overlooked the city. The skyline glittered beneath the dark velvet of night. "They tried to choke my voice," he said quietly. "So now I'll make them listen." Langston Miles didn't believe in noise. He believed in precision. As the public continued dissecting the assault on Flight 762, Langston had already moved beyond the spectacle. He wasn't waiting for apologies. He was writing the next chapter, one press release, one legal maneuver, one boardroom disruption at a time. The war wasn't on the tarmac anymore. It had shifted to corporate airspace. Inside the operations suite, Langston had converted into a temporary command center. A dozen professionals sat around a U-shaped glass table. Legal, PR, cybersecurity, corporate governance, and aviation compliance, all handpicked, all seasoned, and all briefed. No one said the word revenge. Langston had made it clear from day one. This is about reform, not retaliation. but we will win like war generals, not victims. Maya, seated to his right, opened the strategy binder. Phase 1 was evidence consolidation. That's complete. Now we enter Phase 2, destabilization. Langston nodded. Let's begin. First move, shareholder pressure. Within 48 hours, Langston's private equity arm, discreetly named Miles Capital Partners, acquired a further 3.5% stake in Falcon Air through proxy holders. It was now enough to demand a special shareholders meeting and to gain speaking rights on executive decisions. At the same time, a respected financial blog quietly leaked the news: Black CEO behind Flight 762, incident acquires stake, in Falcon calls for leadership review. Imminent. The stock dipped 4% in a single afternoon. Behind the scenes, Langston's legal team filed a formal request to inspect Falcon's internal governance records under federal shareholder law. They cited ongoing concerns regarding patterns of employee abuse, complaint, mismanagement, and C-suite negligence. It wasn't flashy, but it was devastating. By demanding governance transparency, Langston forced Falcon Air's leadership to either comply or admit what they were hiding. Second move, alliances. Langston personally reached out to civil aviation advocates, diversity equity foundations, and quietly 3 former Falcon Air board members who had left in protest years ago. All 3 agreed to meet. At a private suite in a Manhattan tower, they arrived discreetly greeted by Maya and ushered into a quiet conference room. "You're not here for statements," one of them said cautiously. Langston shook his head. "No, I'm here to ask one question. What pushed you out?" One by one, the story spilled out. Board votes overridden, safety audits softened, HR red flags ignored for brand stability. And in each one, Carter Vance's name appeared, not always at the center, but always nearby. He wasn't just protected. One former board member said he was mirrored. They liked his kind of loyalty. The system liked silence with teeth. Langston listened, never interrupting, only occasionally scribbling notes. Then he handed each of them a printed document titled the Flight Standard Initiative. "It's not a company, it's a new standard for aviation culture. I need your names on it, and I need you to speak when the time comes." They hesitated. Then one by one they signed. Third move, controlled escalation. Langston authorized his PR strategist to leak a single detail to a respected aviation journalist. Langston Miles is preparing a formal recommendation for Falcon Air's CEO resignation. No date, no direct quote, just the signal. It spread fast. Morning shows speculated. Podcasts debated. Aviation blogs lit up. Would he do it? Could he? Inside Falcon Air HQ, the pressure cooked. The CEO, a man known for backdoor deals and glossy statements, summoned his inner circle. "He's trying to force my hand," he muttered. "He wants a press war. We won't give it to him." But Langston didn't need a press war. He had something far more terrifying to corporations' momentum. Across LinkedIn, former employees began posting cryptic messages, not surprised by what happened on Flight 762. On Glassdoor, anonymous reviews reappeared with timestamps dating back years: toxic leadership. Complaint suppression is standard. And in the background, Langston's team launched Clear Sky, an anonymous whistleblower portal open to all Falcon employees, current or former. Within 72 hours, over 600 submissions. Some were minor, others were chilling. I was told not to serve a passenger wine because he looked unstable. He was wearing a durag. My supervisor said, "Don't escalate anything from a black man, just nod and walk away." We had a handbook. We had another handbook we were told to follow. Langston reviewed each one. Every account made the case stronger. Every voice turned the pressure dial up another notch. And through it all, he never once spoke to the media. He let the silence grow louder than scandal. On the 7th day, Falcon's stock dropped another 3%. Their board issued a tepid memo. "We stand against all forms of discrimination and are evaluating our leadership pathways." Langston smiled faintly when he read it. They weren't leading. They were reacting. And they were playing his game now. The conference room on the 43rd floor of Falcon Air's Manhattan headquarters was built for control. Floor-to-ceiling glass gave the illusion of transparency. White marble floors reflected fluorescent lights with sterile precision. The table custom-built Italian oak stretched like a runway. At the head sat the CEO, Walter Dresch, flanked by 3 senior board members and 2 legal advisors. Across from them sat Langston Miles, alone. No legal team, no assistant, no entourage. Just a black notebook in front of him and a calm that unsettled everyone in the room. Mr. Miles Dresch began, his voice smooth with practiced diplomacy. We understand you've made some public suggestions about our leadership. We hope today's meeting will clear up any misunderstandings. Langston didn't blink. There are no misunderstandings, just confirmation. The temperature dropped slightly. Dresch forced a chuckle. Let's be constructive. We recognize the incident on Flight 762 was regrettable. Our investigation is ongoing and disciplinary action has been taken against the employee involved. Langston opened his notebook. Inside were no notes, just a printed copy of an internal HR email recently leaked to his team. He slid it across the table. One of the board members picked it up, eyes scanning quickly, then slowly, then with growing alarm. It read, per directive from exec team, if questions state that Vance's prior incidents were performance misunderstandings, do not disclose complaint history unless legally compelled. Langston waited as the silence bloomed. I'm not here to negotiate, he said plainly. I'm here to hold you accountable. Dresch's jaw twitched. You have no authority to demand anything from this board. Langston leaned forward, voice steady. You're right. I don't need to demand. I just expose. He reached into his briefcase and retrieved a second folder. Thicker, heavier. It landed with a dull thud. Inside, dozens of sworn testimonies, timestamped complaint records, a report from a former compliance officer, and signed statements from 3 former board members. Then came the final blow. Langston laid down a printed screenshot of the Clear Sky portal analytics. 621 verified accounts, 312 direct allegations of racially biased service, 98 naming Carter Vance, 15 linking those actions to senior leadership approval. We've filed a formal petition with the Department of Transportation Civil Rights Division, Langston said. An inquiry into systemic misconduct and discriminatory practices in passenger service training protocols and executive shielding. The boardroom stiffened. You'll be served within the week, he continued, unless you adopt the flight standard protocols publicly within 48 hours and Walter Dresch resigns. The room exploded. You're extorting a resignation, one board member barked. This is blackmail, another muttered. Langston raised a hand not in aggression but in pause. No, he said calmly. This is a mirror. You created this culture. I'm just reflecting it back to you with evidence. Dresch leaned forward now, voice low and defensive. You think you're a hero. You're trying to bring down a company over one bad employee. Langston's tone never changed. I'm not trying to bring down Falcon Air. I'm trying to rebuild what you failed to protect. Trust. For a moment, Dresch faltered, because he could feel it, the tide turning, the optics crumbling, the headlines already writing themselves. Langston stood. The cameras are waiting outside, he said. They know I'm here. They know what I've seen. But I promised them no statement yet. He paused at the door. You have 48 hours, not for my sake, but for yours. As he stepped out, the tension followed like a shadow. Downstairs, Maya was waiting. How'd it go? She asked. They heard me, Langston replied. She handed him his phone. You need to see this. He glanced at the screen. It was a clip from that morning's aviation union meeting. A representative, unprompted, had stood at the podium and declared, if Falcon Air doesn't commit to reform, we walk. Pilots, cabin crew, everyone. We've seen enough. The room had erupted in applause. Langston allowed himself a rare smile. The confrontation was no longer just between him and Dresch. It was now between a failing system and everyone it once silenced. And this time the silence was done waiting. The first crack didn't appear on national television. It showed up in the form of an internal resignation email leaked by a mid-level compliance officer at Falcon Air. The message, short but damning, read, "I can no longer stay silent within a company that values optics over ethics. I resign effective immediately." It took just 20 minutes for that email to surface on Reddit, then LinkedIn, then Twitter. By noon, 3 more anonymous resignations followed. By 3 p.m., a journalist at the Atlantic Flyer published an expose sourced from a Falcon Air intern inside the cabin of silence. How Falcon Air buried a decade of discrimination complaints. The article included internal chat logs, spreadsheet screenshots, and email chains between HR and legal advisors, where phrases like "just make it disappear" and "he's not press-worthy" were casually tossed around when referring to employee abuse claims. It was no longer rumor, it was revelation. And with that, the system began to implode. Langston didn't gloat, he didn't post, he didn't even return press calls. Instead, he sat quietly with his legal and operations teams reviewing the incoming tsunami of data pouring through the Clear Sky portal. Each submission now formed not just a legal case, but a cultural indictment. From mechanics to gate agents, dozens of Falcon employees broke their silence. "I was told to avoid boarding certain demographics in first class if we were overbooked. Our discretion policy was a shield to deny people who didn't look wealthy." Once a captain made a joke about urban turbulence on a New York flight. Nothing happened. Carter Vance was promoted after 3 filed complaints. He was a brand protector. That's what they called him. And as each voice joined the chorus, the public listened, not because they had to, but because Langston had built the moment so carefully, so deliberately, that the truth became impossible to ignore. Then came the financial collapse. Falcon Air's stock, already bleeding, plummeted another 11% in a single day after an emergency press conference failed to address any specifics. The CEO's generic "we're reviewing our processes" statement was met with mockery online. The top comment on their YouTube upload read, "You're reviewing while we're remembering." Meanwhile, Langston's team released a white paper titled Flight 762, a case study in accountability. Distributed across business schools, corporate boards, and civil rights organizations, it documented the entire arc from initial incident to systemic exposure. It wasn't just a call-out, it was a blueprint for reform. But the final push came from inside the industry itself. One by one, other airlines began distancing themselves from Falcon. Codeshare partners suspended agreements. 3 international airports flagged Falcon Air's access for pending compliance review. And then, in the most devastating blow, the Federal Aviation Regulatory Council issued an official audit order under Title 49, Section 4170, Non-Discrimination in Air Transportation. The audit would be full-scale: interviews, policy scrutiny, historical case review. Every record Falcon had ever buried was now being excavated. Langston stood before the monitors in his war room, arms crossed, eyes calm. Behind him, Maya watched the newsfeed scroll. "You did it," she said quietly. Langston didn't answer right away. He walked to the window, the New York skyline stretching before him. "No," he finally said. "They did it to themselves. I just stopped letting them get away with it." Back at Falcon HQ, chaos reigned. The CEO had locked himself in his office. Board members argued over legal strategies. HR directors whispered in corners, emails being deleted as fast as they could find them. Security was stationed at the front doors, not to keep protesters out, but to prepare for potential subpoenas. And in the middle of it all, someone finally snapped. A junior executive in customer experience stood up during a senior leadership meeting and said, "This isn't repairable until you stop pretending it's contained." She left her ID badge on the table and walked out. 1 minute later, the live feed of a viral protest outside Falcon's flagship terminal went live. Dozens of employees, some in uniform, some not, held hand-drawn signs that read, "We work here. We won't be silent anymore." Flight 762 opened our eyes. It wasn't just Vance, it was all of you. Passengers joined in, retired pilots, former flight attendants, even airport staff from other airlines. No violence, no fire, just truth and unity. And from that moment on, Falcon Air was no longer in control of its story. Langston was. The Falcon Air boardroom, once an altar of polished silence, had become a war zone of whispers and spinning strategy decks. But nothing stuck. The morning after the employee walkout, an emergency board meeting was called. Not virtual, in person, the first in years. Attendance was mandatory. Excuses were not accepted. The room was full, but no one looked comfortable. The air conditioning hummed, but the atmosphere was suffocating. Everyone had seen the footage employees standing outside Falcon's primary terminal, holding signs not of outrage, but of awakening. One phrase had repeated across their cardboard posters, "We believed in this place until you proved us wrong." And now the board had to ask themselves, was Falcon Air salvageable? Walter Dresch, the embattled CEO, sat at the head of the table, paler than usual, his signature navy suit hanging a little looser. He opened the meeting with the same tone he used in shareholder videos, measured, vague, almost hypnotic. "Let's not lose sight of our mission," he began. A cough, a rustle, then silence, but this time no one nodded. Instead, Marianne Corbett, a board member who had kept quiet for over a decade, spoke up. "Walter," she said, voice calm but clipped, "do you still believe we have the moral authority to lead this company?" It was not a rhetorical question. Dresch blinked. No platitudes," she cut in. "Yes or no?" He looked down, then back up. "It's complicated." She turned to the others. "It's not complicated. We've failed over and over, not just to lead, but to listen." For a moment, no one dared breathe. Then another voice chimed in. Elias Chang, the youngest board member, and perhaps the only one who had voted against Vance's promotion years ago. "This is bigger than Vance, bigger than PR. This is systemic," he said. "Langston Miles didn't break this company. He revealed it." A murmur of agreement followed. They were cracking, and not from pressure, from conscience. That afternoon, behind closed doors, Walter Dresch handed in his resignation. There were no cameras, no speeches, just a 2-page letter quietly folded, placed on the table. The news didn't break for another 12 hours. But when it did, it set off a chain reaction. Across aviation blogs and finance channels, the headline appeared in all caps, "Falcon Air CEO steps down amid culture crisis." Underneath it, a second headline trailed, "Langston Miles praises employees not bored for courage to stand up." Indeed, in a rare statement, Langston chose not to target Dresch directly. He said, "Leadership doesn't begin when you rise to power. It begins when you recognize you've failed and choose to step aside. This is not the end. This is the chance for a new beginning." And that's exactly what came next. In an unprecedented move, the Falcon board voted to install an interim ethics transition committee comprised of external advisors, legal observers, and 2 whistleblowers who had come forward during the Clear Sky investigation. For the first time, Falcon Air wasn't run by career executives alone, but by those who had lived the consequences of silence. They named the initiative Clean Sky. Its mission was simple: rewrite internal policies from the ground up, overhaul the crew training curriculum, audit and publish the full archive of misconduct complaints since 2010, and submit to third-party review every 6 months. No lawyers, no NDAs, no hiding. It was brutal transparency, and the public noticed. Passengers began posting about their flights again, not in outrage, but in cautious optimism. "The crew looked different," one woman wrote, "more diverse, more human." Another said, "For the first time, I didn't feel like a problem. I felt like a guest." Behind it all, Langston didn't take a seat on the board. He refused. "This isn't mine to lead," he told Maya, watching a news broadcast in his suite. "It's theirs to reclaim." Still, his fingerprints were everywhere. The protocols, the restructuring templates, the rapid response reporting channels, all mirrored the white paper his team had drafted weeks ago. But this wasn't about ownership. This was about legacy in motion. Even inside Falcon's battered workforce, something was shifting. Supervisors who once barked orders now led listening sessions. Employees who feared retaliation were invited to help write the next era of standards. There were stumbles, there were skeptics, but there was also something new. Belief, not in the past, but in the possibility of something better. As for Langston, he declined every offer to return to Falcon as a consultant. Instead, he issued one final directive to his team. We didn't land the plane for applause. We landed it so someone else could take the cockpit and fly differently. The skies hadn't cleared yet, but for the first time in years, they felt wide open. It started with a spreadsheet. An internal compliance log, dated and redacted, was leaked to the press by a former HR analyst, anonymously uploaded to an encrypted public server. It contained over 400 entries, each line a case, each case a voice. Most had been labeled resolved. None had been addressed. It was undeniable, and it triggered the first wave of real-world consequences. By the end of the week, Falcon Air suspended 11 senior staff members, including 2 regional VPs, 3 base managers, and the former head of flight operations. The news hit fast and hard, and for once, the press releases were not sanitized. The company issued a statement simple and sobering. We failed to protect our passengers. We failed to protect our staff. And now we are being held accountable. The industry had seen scandals before, but nothing like this. This wasn't one person. It was the collapse of an entire command structure. It was no longer just about Langston Miles or even Flight 762. It had become a reckoning across every department, every tier, every unspoken rule that allowed silence to fester in a polished cabin. And regulators responded. The Federal Aviation Regulatory Council, acting on Langston's formal civil petition, launched a Level 3 compliance review, the most invasive form of systemic audit permitted under civil aviation law. Inspectors arrived unannounced at Falcon's 5 regional offices. They demanded crew training manuals, performance evaluations, security footage logs, and interdepartmental memos. They pulled hiring records, promotion justifications, disciplinary files. And what they found shocked even them. One auditor leaked to a journalist under anonymity. There were entire folders of shredded complaints, physically destroyed files. And they weren't from decades ago. Some were from last month. As investigators peeled back the layers, another domino fell. Falcon Air's third-party employee evaluation firm, Skymark Analytics, was suspended by the National Labor Ethics Board. Turns out Skymark had maintained a private scoring algorithm that penalized employees who over-escalated issues, marking them as culture volatile. Translation: if you reported misconduct more than once, you were flagged as a risk. And the airline paid bonuses to managers who kept their team's volatility index below 2%. The exposure of this system sparked outrage not just among employees, but unions, HR firms, and corporate boards across the country. If Falcon was doing it, who else was? Langston never needed to name names. He had forced the machine to name itself. In response, the International Association of Flight Crews called for an emergency summit. Hosted in Chicago, it gathered representatives from over 40 airlines to discuss long-ignored issues: racial bias in service hierarchies, abuse concealment protocols, and internal suppression of whistleblowers. Falcon wasn't just a case anymore. It was a warning, and the ripple spread far beyond the airline industry. Corporate ethics watchdogs cited the Falcon case in 3 major reports to Congress. One headline from the Guardian business section read, "Falcon Collapse Forces Wall Street to Rethink Internal Oversight." And investors took notice. Within days, Falcon's largest shareholder group, Monarch Holdings, demanded a permanent ethics officer be appointed with independent authority from the CEO. It was unprecedented, but no longer optional. Inside Falcon Air's newly established ethics transition, team change was now procedural. All past HR complaints would be reopened for review. Employees were granted amnesty from retaliation for speaking up. A monthly town hall was implemented, mandatory for executives, voluntary for employees. And most importantly, Langston's flight standard protocols were adopted not as suggestion, but as baseline policy. Meanwhile, Langston refused interviews. He didn't want to be the headline. He wanted the system to keep burning itself into truth. Yet privately, Maya informed him of an unexpected message from an international aviation regulator. The Civil Aviation Authority of South Africa had requested access to Langston's white paper. They wanted to replicate the protocol. Langston paused, staring at the request on his screen. "Are they serious?" Maya asked. Langston smiled faintly. "They're not just serious, they're listening." One by one, institutions that had watched from the sidelines began to act not from fear, but from recognition. Because Flight 762 had become more than a scandal. It had become a mirror. And for the first time, people in power were being forced to look into it and answer. It happened without theatrics. No spotlight, no podium, just a man once untouchable sitting in a government hearing room under oath. Walter Dresch, former CEO of Falcon Air, looked smaller now. Gone was the designer suit, the confident posture, the smug cadence of a man protected by title and status. Before him sat a panel of senators and aviation regulators, armed not with rhetoric, but with receipts. Langston Miles watched the hearing from a quiet conference room 2 blocks away. The live feed ran silently on a wall-mounted screen as he reviewed logistics for the next ethics summit. On screen, Dresch cleared his throat. At the time, he said slowly, "We believe the incident was an isolated lapse in judgment." The chairman raised an eyebrow. "Isolated? Your own internal files refer to Mr. Vance as the enforcer." That nickname appeared in 15 separate employee evaluations, none of which resulted in action. "You approved all of them." Dresch opened his mouth, closed it, swallowed hard. Power reversal wasn't always loud. Sometimes it looked like a man realizing his script had run out. Back at Falcon's headquarters, the new ethics committee began reviewing promotion records. For the first time in company history, they reversed a round of executive bonuses, pulling back $1.2 million in compensation from 6 managers who had directly benefited from silence. One executive, Peter Renner, the former VP of Customer Excellence, was served with a subpoena on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, a leaked email showed he had personally intervened to suppress 3 formal complaints about Carter Vance, citing brand vulnerability. The kicker. He wrote, "We can't afford outrage this quarter." Now he faced civil charges under the Corporate Malfeasance Accountability Act. And public sentiment wasn't offering grace. Talk shows, podcasts, town halls, every space once filled with empty outrage now brimmed with analysis and naming. Naming the people, naming the behavior, and most importantly, naming the cost of looking away. In a surprising twist, a group of Falcon Air flight attendants created a video statement. Uniforms crisp, faces calm, voices unshaking. "We were trained to smile through discomfort," one of them said. "To serve every guest equally except when told not to. This isn't a takedown, this is a rising." The video reached 2 million views in a single day. And then came the formal apology. Not a tweet, not a PR video, a handwritten letter. From the newly appointed interim CEO, Carla Dumas, a former compliance officer who had once been demoted for insubordination when she refused to bury a racial profiling report. The letter read in part, "To Mr. Langston Miles and to every passenger who ever felt unwelcome in our care, we failed you, not with one incident, but with a culture that silenced discomfort and rewarded complicity. You reminded us that silence is not neutral. From this day forward, we measure our success not by flight times, but by how many people feel safe in our sky." Langston read the letter twice, quietly. Then he picked up a pen and wrote 4 words on a notepad. Return call to Carla. For the first time, Falcon Air wasn't speaking from fear. They were speaking from humility. But the reversal didn't stop there. Langston received a request from the National Council on Ethical Governance. They wanted him to keynote their summit in Geneva. The theme, Power and Accountability in the Age of the Quiet Majority. He agreed on one condition, that 3 Falcon Air whistleblowers would share the stage with him. Power reversal didn't mean replacing one king with another. It meant shifting the table so that silence no longer had the loudest seat. And while the system shook, Langston stayed focused. He returned to his office, a quiet loft above Manhattan, and reviewed architectural sketches, not of buildings, but of a new nonprofit incubator. One built not for lawsuits, but for institutional rebuilding. He named it Skyline Reset, dedicated to training ethics officers, whistleblower defenders, and corporate transparency consultants. Its founding principle, where systems fail, structure must evolve. As Falcon's board scrambled to rewrite its charter, Langston rewrote the playbook. The balance had shifted, and this time it wasn't shifting back. The first time Carla Dumas stepped into the Falcon Air executive office as interim CEO, she didn't sit behind the desk. She stood by the window. Looking out, not down, there was no entourage, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no catered breakfast spread. Just a room once reserved for silence and spin, now filled with soft echoes of transition. Carla was not a legacy executive. She didn't come from Ivy League boardrooms or airline dynasties. She'd started as a compliance officer, fought quietly against cover-ups, and paid the price with demotion. Now she was leading the very company that once punished her for telling the truth. Her first executive order, a simple one. Every current employee of Falcon Air will complete a new leadership audit, regardless of title, regardless of tenure. The audit wasn't a performance review. It was a conscience check. Questions range from, have you ever ignored behavior you knew was wrong? Have you protected someone who should have been reported? Would you feel safe reporting abuse to your current supervisor? It wasn't about finding scapegoats. It was about exposing culture. And it worked. Over 120 employees voluntarily stepped down, choosing not to complete the audit. Carla didn't name them. She didn't need to. Quiet exits are still accountability, she told her executive council. Not every fire needs to be public. Some just need to stop burning. At her side stood Jacob Reyes, newly appointed director of cabin culture, a former flight attendant who had testified in Langston's dossier. He was now responsible for crew training, language policy escalation protocol, and something Falcon Air had never dared create before, a crew accountability forum where employees could anonymously rate senior staff and receive monthly feedback reports on leadership behavior. It was radical, it was uncomfortable, and it was working. Langston watched it unfold from the sidelines, respectfully distant but silently encouraged. He received a private message from Jacob one evening, I never thought I'd wear this badge again. But I get it now. We're not here to fly the same plane. We're here to rebuild the runway. Meanwhile, outside the walls of Falcon Air, the airline industry took notice. 3 major U.S. carriers contacted Carla within weeks. They didn't ask for advice. They asked for access to the audit templates, to the revised crew protocols, to the leadership code Langston's team had embedded in the white paper. It wasn't charity, it was replication. For the first time, change wasn't just reactive, it was contagious. At the heart of it all, Carla kept the mission clear. Every Thursday, she held an open Zoom call with Falcon staff at all levels. No agenda, no filters, just a space where any one ground crew pilot accountant could speak directly. Sometimes no one showed up. Sometimes over 100 did. One day, a 22-year-old intern spoke up. I joined Falcon because I needed a job. Now, I feel like I'm part of a promise. Carla didn't cry, but later that night, she wrote the words down in her journal. A promise, not a policy. That phrase became the company's new slogan. It replaced the old one, fly above the rest. Langston smiled when he saw the update in an industry newsletter. He hadn't written that line, but he recognized it. It came from the spirit of those who never stop believing that change doesn't need noise. It just needs leaders. The kind who don't wait to be appointed. The kind who rise quietly. The kind who step forward not when it's easy, but when it costs them everything. Falcon Air didn't just have a new CEO, it had a new soul, and it was finally ready to fly on its own terms. At exactly 9:00 a.m. on a rainy Monday, Falcon Air's new code of conduct went live. Not in a locked HR database, not hidden behind a staff login portal, but publicly on their homepage. Anyone could read it. Passengers, employees, journalists, competitors. It began not with policy, but with a statement. This airline does not tolerate silence. This airline does not reward fear. This airline exists to serve with dignity or not at all. It wasn't corporate branding. It was a line in the sand. One Langston Miles had long envisioned and one Carla Dumas now enforced. The new code had teeth. Mandatory de-escalation training every 60 days for flight and gate staff. Anonymous peer review evaluations that impacted bonus eligibility. An AI-assisted bias detection system reviewing recorded crew interactions and flagging tone disparities across demographics. Real-time behavior alerts, a private channel where passengers could flag inappropriate service during a flight without confrontation. But most revolutionary of all, the Falcon Ethics Ledger, a publicly accessible log updated monthly with number of complaints, resolution status, disciplinary actions taken, pending investigations, unfiltered, unredacted, unapologetic. It was the airline industry's first radical step toward transparency. The press went wild. Some praised Falcon as visionary. Others accused them of virtue signaling. But Langston knew better. He watched Carla hold the first press conference after the policy launch. No teleprompter, no rehearsed answers, just clarity. "We know what people are thinking," she said. "They're asking, is this real? Here's the answer, yes. Because we know the cost of pretending too well for too long." Behind the cameras, a man from the Department of Transportation nodded slowly. He wasn't there for show. He was there to document compliance evolution, a new metric that regulators would soon use to evaluate whether airlines were preventing or permitting abuse. And Falcon Air wasn't just compliant. They were defining the category. Meanwhile, Langston's nonprofit Skyline Reset had published a 72-page playbook titled Institutional Morality, Designing Organizations That Outlive Scandal. It was downloaded 40,000 times in its first week. Corporate boards began asking the same question in closed meetings across industries. What's our Falcon risk back inside Falcon HQ? The institutional change reached even deeper. The recruiting process was overhauled. Resumes were anonymized for first-round screening names, schools, even addresses removed. Why? Because bias creeps in through familiarity, and Falcon was no longer afraid to admit it. Hiring panels now included one ethics-trained observer, not from HR, but from an employee-elected body called the Passenger Promise Council. Their job: ensure every interview question aligned with dignity first service. Crew uniforms were redesigned, not for fashion but function. They now featured accessibility tools, sewn in sensory tags for neurodivergent flight attendants, braille nameplates, gender neutral, fits as default, not by request. Langston received a box one afternoon, inside a folded Navy jacket, the new uniform. With a handwritten note, "You never wore this, but you carried it further than anyone ever has. From all of us, thank you, Falcon crew." He didn't cry, but he paused for a long time before folding it back into the box. Hands slow, reverent. One night over dinner, Maya asked, "Do you think they'll keep this up when the media moves on?" Langston looked out the window at the city lights. "They don't have a choice anymore," he said. "We changed the system's immune response. The next time it tries to reject truth, it'll feel it. In its brand, its bottom line, its people. That was the point of institutional reform, not to create perfection, but to remove immunity from imperfection, to make truth part of the process. And now it was. Falcon wasn't flying higher because of PR. It was flying straighter because of principle, and the system finally had learned how to breathe clean air. It started with a thread, just a few sentences posted on a community forum by a user named @MothersInFlight. My son watched the Flight 762 footage. He asked me if they would have choked me too. I didn't know how to answer, but I told him the man didn't yell. He just held his ground. Now my son wants to be a CEO. That post was shared 40,000 times in a single day. People didn't share it because it was shocking. They shared it because it was familiar, because they remembered the little humiliations, the sidelong glances at airport lounges, the "you must be in the wrong line" stares, the polite refusals that weren't about rules, but about who the rules were made for. Langston Miles had always known the real battle wasn't at 30,000 feet. It was at eye level, and now the world was waking up to it. Universities began adding Flight 762 power, perception, and policy to their business ethics curriculum. Law schools dissected the legal frameworks Langston's team had leveraged to turn a civil rights violation into a full-blown corporate reckoning. But more importantly, people were speaking up at scale. The hashtag #I was762 began to trend. It wasn't created by Langston or his team. It came from passengers, everyday flyers, who finally found the language to express what had once been dismissed as bad service. Told I didn't look like I belonged in the exit row, had to prove my domin status 3 times, watched my white colleague get champagne. I got pretzels. These weren't complaints, they were testimonies. Social media turned into a rolling archive of subtle injustice. But unlike before, these stories weren't drowned out. They were believed. And then came the campaigns. A grassroots group called Cabin Watch launched a mobile app where passengers could submit anonymous flight experiences in real time. It logged location crew interaction summaries and post-flight follow-ups. Within 2 weeks, the app had 120,000 users. Airlines across the country were suddenly under public review, not just from travel blogs, but from passengers who had finally found their voice. Even major brands began issuing statements. We stand with dignity at 35,000 feet. We've read the Falcon papers. We're reviewing our own structures. For years, corporate social responsibility had been an aesthetic. Now it was a requirement. Maya called Langston one evening breathless. "You're not going to believe this," she said. A group of teenage activists just staged a silent protest at LAX. Langston blinked. Teenagers. She sent the link. The video showed them standing in line at the Falcon Airgate uniform, black hoodies, each with a number printed on the back, 762. No chanting, no signs, just presence. A still visual echo. The video amassed 8 million views in 24 hours. The message was clear. We saw what you tried to silence. We won't unsee it now. Churches began preaching sermons on dignity and daily systems. Bookstores highlighted selections on structural bias and silent power. One poet even released a chapbook titled Cabin Pressure, dedicated to those who refused to descend quietly. Langston watched all of it from a distance. He was never the focus, but everywhere his influence was felt. One Sunday morning, walking through Union Station, he overheard a gate agent gently stop a customer and say, "We'll get this fixed, sir. We treat everyone with first-class service, regardless of ticket." Langston didn't interrupt. He just smiled. For years, politeness had been used as a disguise for exclusion. Now it was being redefined as integrity in motion. Not everyone welcomed the shift. Pundits grumbled about overcorrection, corporate paranoia, and social justice turbulence. Langston never responded, because he didn't need to justify progress to those who never experienced regression. Change didn't need consensus, it just needed clarity. And now the public had it. At a town hall hosted by Skyline Reset, a young mother stood up and said, "My daughter's 12. She watched the hearing with me. She asked why the man didn't scream. I told her because sometimes power doesn't scream, it just moves." The audience stood in silence, then applause. Not explosive, but steady, measured, like the march of something that couldn't be reversed. The public had awakened, and they weren't just watching, they were demanding more. The shockwaves didn't stop at Falcon Air. They reverberated through every boardroom with an airline logo on the wall. In the weeks following Falcon's collapse and reinvention, competitor airlines scrambled to assess their own internal vulnerabilities. Some did it quietly, issuing diversity review memos buried behind login walls. Others tried preemptive PR campaigns with glossy slogans about reaffirmed values and listening better. But the public had changed. They weren't looking for slogans, they were looking for systems, and they weren't afraid to ask hard questions. Jetlandia, one of Falcon's closest rivals, announced a new chief ethics officer position, then faced backlash when the role was filled by a former PR executive with no compliance or HR background. The news broke fast and harder. One viral tweet captured the mood perfectly. "You can't patch culture with a press badge." Within 48 hours, Jetlandia backtracked and opened the position for public applications. The requirement: 10 years of field experience, not desk work. Within 3 weeks, they hired a whistleblower protection lawyer who had worked with Langston's Skyline Reset initiative. That wasn't a coincidence. Langston's playbook was being adopted not by force, but by necessity. In response to rising pressure, the Federal Aviation Review Board, FARB, unveiled a new framework: Flight Culture Compliance Ratings, a 5-tier index that would be posted alongside safety and punctuality metrics on federal and travel sites. The top 3 weighted factors: resolution time for discrimination complaints; 2, independent audit participation; 3, passenger dignity incident reports. It was a quiet revolution. Airlines had never been judged by how fair they were, only how fast. Now fairness had entered the flight plan. For the first time, industry watchdogs held real influence. Travel magazines published ethics ratings next to their best business class lists. Booking platforms began offering filters, show airlines participating in Skyline Reset standards. Even aircraft manufacturers weighed in. A joint statement from Airbus and Boeing outlined their intention to include passenger dignity metrics in operator evaluations, a move that sent shockwaves through the leasing industry because now even the planes were paying attention. Langston received a letter from the CEO of a major international airline based in Europe. It read, "We've translated your Falcon paper into 4 languages. We're adopting the training protocol. If you'd ever consider consulting, our door is open. But if not, know this: your quiet stand made our loud change possible." He didn't respond publicly. He didn't need to. The echo spoke for itself. Flight schools began updating their curriculum. Instructors who once emphasized containment during service conflicts now taught conscious recognition. Role plays were redesigned to include unconscious bias, economic profiling, and tone regulation. In one training room in Arizona, a young Black woman, now in her final months of becoming a flight attendant, shared during a debrief, "For the first time, I don't feel like I'm learning how to shrink. I'm learning how to lead." The instructor, a former Falcon Air captain, nodded solemnly. "Good. That's what skies should feel like." Beyond aviation, other industries began to feel the rumble. Hospitality giants like Marvo Hotels and Swan Point Cruises adopted internal complaint resolution dashboards directly inspired by Falcon's public ethics ledger. Major rideshare apps created in-trip flag systems for discriminatory driver behavior. And quietly behind the scenes, private equity groups began adjusting their risk models. A leaked memo from Hudson Ridge Capital read, "Organizations without structural dignity, mechanisms are now ESG liabilities." Translation: if you don't protect your people, your stock value is a liability waiting to happen. Langston watched all this from a quiet balcony, coffee in hand, Maya beside him scrolling through headlines. "You didn't just shake the plane," she said. "You moved the air around it." He smiled faintly. "It was never about grounding Falcon," he replied. "It was about making the sky safer for everyone. From Tokyo to Toronto, from budget carriers to luxury fleets, from interns to C-suites, people were listening. And they were no longer echoing the old answers. They were forming new ones. The final piece didn't come from a reporter. It came from a janitor. An envelope unmarked was dropped into Skyline Reset's downtown mailbox. No return address, no signature, just a note scribbled on the flap. "I was told to burn this. I didn't. Do with it what's right." Inside, 46 printed pages of internal Falcon Air memos. At first glance, they appeared standard meeting summaries, incident logs, communication reports. But page 17 changed everything. It was a transcript of a closed-door executive call. Date 11 months before Flight 762. Participants Walter Dresch, Peter Renner, and 2 board members. Subject Carter Vance. The transcript was clear. He gets results. He keeps rowdy passengers in check. The complaints don't matter unless one goes viral. Langston read the sentence twice. The complaints don't matter unless one goes viral. That wasn't negligence. That was a strategy. He passed the file to Maya, who immediately froze. "This isn't just cover-up," she whispered. "This is premeditated negligence. Calculated bias management." The document didn't just implicate Vance. It implicated the culture that made him possible and profitable. Langston's legal team verified the source. The call had been recorded by an assistant instructed to take shorthand, who instead printed a full transcript and kept it for protection. She'd never worked in aviation again, but now her words would fly farther than any plane. 3 days later, Langston stood before a press panel. He rarely spoke directly to the media, but this couldn't be delegated. The room fell silent the moment he stepped behind the podium. "When I boarded Flight 762, I didn't expect courtesy. I expected policy. What I received wasn't just abuse. It was approved abuse, crafted, protected, and buried by men who valued power over people. And now you can read it for yourself." He held up the transcript. By nightfall, it was everywhere. News outlets, international forums, aviation roundtables, ethics newsletters. People no longer debated if Falcon Air had failed. They now saw how it had chosen to. The exposure rippled through every level of accountability. The Department of Justice opened a formal inquiry into obstruction of passenger rights. The SEC launched a parallel investigation into Falcon's risk disclosure failures to shareholders. 3 Falcon board members resigned within 48 hours, one of them releasing a personal apology video. "I knew. I stayed. I won't pretend I deserve forgiveness. But I want to begin with truth." And then came the class action suit, filed by a coalition of 218 former Falcon passengers and 37 ex-employees, represented by a legal team partially funded by Skyline Reset. The claim patterned systemic discrimination and intentional suppression of civil rights claims. The potential liability, $790 million. Langston didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. Instead, he sat in his office with the lights off, watching the city outside blink quietly beneath the weight of everything. This, he said softly to Maya, was the bruise beneath the uniform. She nodded. And now the bruise is visible. Not metaphorically, literally. Public murals began appearing across cities. One in Chicago showed a silhouette in a flight attendant's uniform, face cracked open like porcelain. Inside gears. Cameras. Memos. Receipts. At the bottom, a quote from Langston's hearing testimony. "If dignity isn't designed into the system, then cruelty isn't an accident, it's a feature." The mural went viral. Langston's image, once rarely public, became iconic, not because of his face, but because of what it represented: proof that calm could collapse empires. The final exposure wasn't loud. It was clinical, documented, time-stamped. and indisputable. Langston's team published the transcript emails corroborating whistleblower testimony and regulatory complaints as a public archive titled The Blueprint of Silence. It was downloaded by 1.2 million people in 72 hours. One comment captured the collective reaction: "We always felt the abuse. Now we can prove it." Falcon Air didn't just lose passengers. It lost the luxury of plausible deniability. The final veil had dropped, and now even the sky felt different. No banners, no interviews, no front-page photographs. When Langston Miles won, it didn't come with a standing ovation. It came in the form of stillness, the kind that settles after a storm, not because the wind has stopped, but because everything it tore down is finally being rebuilt. Falcon Air still flew, but it no longer soared on status. It flew on structure, new policies, new oversight, new leadership, and above all, new respect. Langston wasn't on board for the symbolic inaugural flight after the reforms. He wasn't at the press briefing. He wasn't in the photographs of Carla Dumas cutting the ceremonial ribbon at the new Ethics and Training Center in Atlanta. He was across the country, sitting quietly at a middle school auditorium in Newark, New Jersey. A teacher had invited him weeks ago, not expecting a reply. Her email had been short: "My students followed everything. They watched the hearing. They memorized your quote. Some are asking questions I don't know how to answer. Would you come speak to them not as a CEO, but as a person?" Langston hadn't hesitated. He took the red eye, no entourage, no security, just a notebook in his coat pocket and the same worn briefcase he'd carried since the Zurich trip, the one that began it all. He spoke to 32 seventh graders that morning. No camera crews, no tweets, just eyes filled with questions no textbook had ever addressed. "What did it feel like when he choked you?" Langston didn't blink. He answered slowly. "It felt like I didn't matter to him. But I reminded myself I still mattered to me." A girl in the front row scribbled it down. Later, she'd use that sentence as the opening line of her speech at the Citywide Youth Justice Symposium. Langston didn't stay for applause. He left a copy of The Blueprint of Silence with the school librarian and boarded the afternoon train home. At the terminal, a Falcon Air representative spotted him. She didn't speak at first, just walked over slowly. "Mr. Miles," she said, carefully, voice steady. "I'm sorry. Not for them, for myself. I never said anything when I saw things." Langston offered a gentle nod. "But you're speaking now." She smiled faintly, eyes misting. "We see you differently now. We see ourselves differently." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. That was the victory, not in court filings or viral headlines, but in the quiet rewiring of how people move through the world. Even in silence, Langston's influence reshaped the sky. At Skyline Reset headquarters, the team continued working, helping banks, hospitals, universities, and tech companies adopt their dignity-centered governance model. Langston rarely stepped into the spotlight. He spent more time reading letters. One came from a 9-year-old boy in Seattle. "I used to think people like me couldn't sit in the front. But now I know the seat doesn't give me value. I bring the value with me. Thank you for reminding me." Langston kept that one in his wallet, next to a photograph of his mother. She had once cleaned planes for a living. He remembered her hands chapped, meticulous, holding a scrub brush like it was sacred. She'd never flown first class, but now her son had changed what it meant for others. He didn't need a legacy plaque. He didn't need a wing of a terminal named after him. He just needed the system to stop hurting people who didn't scream when they were mistreated. The world had noticed his restraint, but what they truly respected was his precision. He didn't burn the house down. He rewired the foundation. On the day Falcon Air officially passed a global passenger dignity audit, the first airline in history to receive a perfect score, Langston didn't attend the ceremony. He was planting trees in a local park, part of a Quiet Saturday initiative he'd been funding anonymously for years. The team wore matching shirts that read "Rooted in Reform." One volunteer whispered to another, "Is that him?" The other nodded. "Yeah, but don't point. He doesn't like fanfare." Langston heard them. He smiled and kept digging. The wind moved softly through the leaves above, the same wind that once carried his silence through a storm. Now it carried something else: peace. Years later, most people didn't remember Flight 762 by its number. They remembered what it stood for. Universities began referring to it as the quiet turning point in business ethics casebooks. Professors cited Langston Miles not just as a CEO, but as an architect of dignity-driven disruption, a man who never shouted, never threatened, and yet still managed to reform an entire industry from the inside out. His name became a case study, but Langston never chased recognition. He declined honorary degrees. He refused to license his name for documentaries. He rejected a foundation proposal to create the Langston Miles Chair of Corporate Justice. Instead, he asked for something else: use the funds to build training labs. One in every city, call them reset room spaces where people learn how to speak up before it's too late. And that's exactly what they did. By the fifth anniversary of Flight 762, there were 31 reset rooms across the United States. Each one looked different, some tucked in community centers, others nestled inside public libraries, but they shared the same mission: teach ordinary people how to challenge extraordinary systems. The walls bore a single phrase: respect is not a privilege, it's a platform. Build it. Let's share it. Langston visited every room quietly, never announcing his arrival. He sat in the back, listened to the discussions, read the wall notes, smiled at the scribbled quotes taped beside coffee machines. We don't raise our voices, we raise our standards. Meanwhile, Falcon Air had become something of a case study in its own right, not for failure, but for how institutions could survive collapse by choosing humility over denial. They had stayed the course. They hadn't just adopted protocols, they'd reinvented the soul of the organization. They published an annual passenger integrity report co-authored by an independent panel of ethics officers, union reps, and former passengers. Their workforce, once 87% white and male in leadership, was now the most diverse in the industry. Their annual retreats weren't held in luxury resorts, but in community schools and shelters where executives were required to spend a full day shadowing underrepresented workers, learning not how to lead, but how to listen. It wasn't PR, it was penance. And it worked. Surveys ranked Falcon Air #1 in public trust for 3 consecutive years. Not for comfort, not for speed, for respect. Langston, now older, grayer, more weathered around the eyes, lived in a quiet lakeside home miles from the city. He spent mornings walking trails, afternoons writing longhand in a leather journal, and evenings sitting by the fire with no television, just silence. Visitors came rarely. When they did, he welcomed them with tea and a question. What did you notice about the silence most didn't understand at first? But then they'd pause and think, and they'd say things like, "It helped me hear myself. It wasn't empty, it was full of something I'd ignored. It reminded me that calm is a kind of strength too." Langston would nod, because that's what he'd always known, that the world had taught people to shout to be heard. But some victories, especially the ones that last, don't come from noise. They come from precision, patience, and moral clarity that doesn't blink under pressure. One winter evening, Maya visited. Now a board member of Skyline Reset, she'd flown in for their annual meeting but detoured to the lake instead. They sat in silence for a while. Then she handed him a folded newspaper. The front page headline read, "First airline in Africa adopts reset protocols after passenger mistreatment, sparks global outcry." Langston read the article quietly, a ripple from a stone he had thrown years ago. Still moving, still widening, still mattering. Maya smiled. "You didn't just ground a plane, Langston. You launched a movement." He didn't respond, but his eyes glistened slightly in the firelight. That night, he opened his journal and wrote a single sentence: "Legacy isn't what follows you. It's what stands when you stop walking." There's a story they tell now at every skyline reset orientation. It doesn't begin with Flight 762. It begins with a question Langston Miles once asked a group of new ethics officers during a quiet training retreat. What would you do if justice had no audience? No one answered right away, because the question stripped away reward. It wasn't asking about heroism under lights. It was asking who you'd be when no one applauded, no one filmed, and no one noticed. Langston had learned early the most powerful form of resistance isn't loud. It's steady. It's in how you look someone in the eye when they try to erase your presence. It's in the choice to respond with principle when rage would be justified. And above all, it's in remembering who you are, even when the world insists you're less. He never raised his voice on Flight 762. He didn't need to, because dignity, when fully intact, speaks loud enough. That moment, his silence against violence became more than a viral video. It became a standard. Years later, an entire module in business schools is dedicated to that confrontation. Not because it was explosive, but because it redefined power without performance. Langston didn't shout, curse, or retaliate. He acted with calm, strategic defiance and brought down a culture of sanctioned abuse, not with fury, but with facts. And that was the deeper legacy. He didn't become an icon by fighting for himself. He became a symbol by fighting past himself for systems, for structure, for people he would never meet. Even those who once dismissed his methods now admitted he hadn't just demanded accountability. He had taught the world how to architect it. A news outlet once ran a retrospective titled "The Man Who Redefined Justice at 30,000 Feet." But Langston would have preferred a simpler headline, "The Man Who Stayed Seated and Still Stood Tall." His legacy wasn't in awards. He declined them all. His legacy was in airports that now train staff to read more than just boarding passes, in executive suites where diversity meant more than optics, in passengers who now recorded not out of distrust but out of determination to never let silence win again. He had changed the air, made it breathable for people long suffocated by condescension, and he never once asked to be praised for it, because Langston understood something few leaders ever do. Victory isn't the applause after justice. Victory is when injustice learns it can't repeat itself. His nonprofit Skyline Reset now reached 24 countries. Its protocols were used in schools, tech startups, hospitals, and even local governments. Anywhere human dignity could be compromised, his work served as a guidepost not just to punish the wrong, but to prevent it. And though Langston no longer traveled much, he still received one letter every week, handwritten, no return address. Always signed in simply "a voice you helped find." They came from all walks of life. A retired flight attendant in Johannesburg, a first-generation college student in Detroit, a nurse in Manila, a high school junior in rural Idaho, all with stories that had echoes of Langston's flight, all with endings rewritten by courage. He kept the letters in a box by his desk, labeled in black ink, "Proof of Flight," because in the end, he didn't just bring a plane down, he lifted others up. And that's the legacy that matters. Not fame, but function. Not vengeance, but vision. Not retribution, but rebuilding. Because Langston never wanted revenge on Falcon Air. He wanted to make sure no one else would ever need the courage he was once forced to summon. And he did. So the next time someone tells you justice only works when it's loud, remember Langston Miles, a black CEO, choked in first class, and still the most powerful man on that plane. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch more gripping stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.